And there's a couple of ground theories that kind of lead you in the way of motivation. First is the possible selves theory brought forth by Marcus Aurelius during 1986, which deals with the ideal self and the ought to self, like what you would like yourself to be versus what you think others expect of you. And alongside this is the self-discrepancy theory by Higgins in 1987, only a year after, which deals with the discrepancy between the actual and the possible selves, and the realization that this discrepancy can serve as a future self-guide. In this case, we're talking about teachers, so we're focusing on teacher motivation. The existing literature also defines this as the driving force to choose the teaching profession. And this may impact the actual teaching as well as students' motivation. A teacher's motivation can consist of both motivators and demotivators, and it can be affected by a wide variety of mediators, which will be further explained in this presentation. It's very important to note, though, that motivation may be context specific, meaning it can change or it can be affected depending on the context where it takes place. Some of these can be the social linguistic context, the geographical context, and the financial context. Another important part of this research is teaching experience, especially because we made a distinction between pre-service teachers, people who are studying to become teachers, and in-service teachers, people who are practicing the teaching profession. From our research, pre-service teachers are thought to hold the key to the future of L2 teaching, but they obviously lack the teaching experience, which makes them unsure about or not knowledgeable enough about what they are about to face in the real teaching world. And they have obviously not yet formed a professional identity, but it's shown in research that they tend to hold very strong ideal selves, both intrinsic and altruistic motivation. Another important topic is teacher education, since this is what shapes teacher motivation and commitment, as well as is the tool that really helps teachers be prepared and be ready for the reality of what teaching really entails. From the literature review, from our research, a few issues emerge that we wanted to take note of. First is that most research is focused solely or primarily on motivators. Demotivation, and especially demotivators, are very scarce to find in other research. They're not very explored, which is why we decided to make it the focus of our study. There's also very little consideration of socioeconomic factors on teacher motivation, how it can affect a teacher's motivation, as well as very limited evidence of pre-service teachers and in-service teachers and their differences when it comes to motivation. There's also not a lot of focus put into the context-dependent nature of teacher motivation. And lastly, the potential impact of the pandemic on teacher motivation. From this, the following research questions emerge for this study. First, what is the nature of teacher motivation of Chilean EFL teachers? Second, how do pre-service and in-service teacher motivation differ? And third, how does the pandemic affect teacher motivation? As for the methodology of this research, first, it's important to understand the context. This was conducted, in Chile, specifically about EFL teaching, where the majority of L2 teachers were at some point L2 learners, since English is a second language here. It's also important and interesting to note that in this country currently, there's a demand for improvement of teaching quality and effectiveness. We can especially see this in recent research that has been conducted. For example, the English Proficiency Index for Latin American countries studied in 2020 in the proficiency of different countries in English. Chile scored only 523 points out of 800, whilst other countries like Argentina, Puerto Rico, etc., scored much higher, which just shows the gap and the improvement that could still be made when it comes to English proficiency in the country. Another very important note to have is the differences among educational sectors in the country, more specifically, public and private. This is evidenced in the Agencia de Calidad de la Educación in this country. In their studies, their results show the different socioeconomic groups. First, in the higher group, the private sector, 85% of students reach the basic and intermediate levels, whilst in the lower groups, the public sector, only 9% reach the basic and intermediate levels. So enormous gap between the two. And finally, this study was conducted in the middle of a pandemic during August and September of 2020. So as we did take this into consideration when developing our instruments and analyzing our data, the study's objective was not to investigate the impact of the pandemic on teacher motivation. The participants of our study consisted of 15 Chilean EFL teachers, 3 of them male, 12 of them female. Their ages ranged from 20 years old up to more than 40, and all of them were EFL learners themselves, having Spanish as their first language. 11 were in-service teachers and 4 pre-service teachers. Of those, 2 of them worked in the public sector, 3 in the private sector, and 3 in the subsidized sector. And their teaching experiences range from 1 year to more than 10 years of experience. To collect our data, we staged semi-structured in-depth interviews that lasted between 30 and 40 minutes, depending on the teacher. All of the interviews were conducted in Spanish and later translated. The interview itself followed the same pattern with the same prompts for every teacher, as you can see here in your screens. It was subject to change depending on each interviewee. Some of them tended to focus more on one topic, while others on others. That depended on the person, but they were overall the same. And the only difference between in-service and pre-service teachers is that pre-service teachers got an additional prompt, which were factors that may affect their future motivation, like how they projected themselves once they actually became teachers. But that was the only difference. To analyze our data, which ended up being approximately 450 minutes of transcribed interviews, grounded theory was employed. So there was an initial exploration of the transcripts in which recurrent themes were identified. Further exploration using those emerged themes, which were then coded and further analyzed.
In the results section, we showed the aspects that affected teachers' motivation to some extent. So the coding resulted in 3 overall themes: motivators, demotivators, and mediators. There were 4 main motivators found. First, passion for teaching, which refers to the passion of each teacher's passion for the act of teaching itself. This came out of expressions like, it is what I like and I'm going to die being a teacher. Second, teaching as a skill involved the teacher's self-improvement, perseverance, and instrumental use of the pedagogy in their lives. So it is very well represented in Fernandez's quote. I have felt motivated to seek interactive activities and create games. I am mastering the computer, the internet, and applications. Third, English as a language, which involves the positive perceptions of teachers and the instrumental use of the English language. And expressions like, I love English, or I wanted to study something with English, express how they, their preference for the English language itself. In the case of students learning, this showed how teachers were interested in the students' perceptions and improvements. So for example, Rodrigo expresses very well when he said that sparkle in their eyes, saying, how could I miss that? In the case of demotivators, 7 main demotivators were identified, being public policy and governmental system the most mentioned, with expressions like It is very unpleasant to feel that people are making decisions that directly influence your work as a teacher, referring to the Chilean authorities that know quite little about the reality of Chilean classrooms. In the case of lack of appreciation of teaching as a profession, it is very well explained by Maria when she said, teaching is not something so well seen in our society, which is completely absurd. Another demotivators identified were school policy and decision making, curriculum restrictions, focus on tests, class size, teaching hours, and students' misbehavior. Interestingly, the themes with lower frequencies were very surprising because they were commonly mentioned in previous research. In the case of mediators, there were 10 main themes identified, of which I'm going to explain only the two most mentioned ones. So first, collegiality among the members of the schools, which came out of expressions like colleagues are like friends or family, showing that a good or bad relationship among the members of the school could motivate or demotivate the teachers to some extent. School financial resources refers to the resources and feasibilities that schools offer. Okay, so for example, in this case, Maria expresses, in a private establishment that suddenly is wonderful because you have between 20 and 25 students and you have many more opportunities to do other things. She's referring to the noticeable gap between public and private schools in their opportunities. Another mediators found were appreciation and evaluation from others, school support, influence from others, salary, teacher training programs, students' level of English, students' motivation, and time availability. Based on those findings, several aspects of teacher motivation were discussed. For example, teacher motivation can vary depending on the context that teachers work in. So, for example, this could lead us to the conclusion that motivation is an individual difference because each teacher can be demotivated or motivated by different factors. However, some factors affected teacher motivation in similar ways across contexts. So in this sense, our targets should focus on policy making and teacher education programs, because this was the most mentioned by our participants and also because it affects all teachers. Regardless, some things that emerged from our results proved to be context specific. So for example, English as a language could only appear in EFL context. And in the case of governmental policies, every country has different policies, right? By making a comparison between the participants' perceptions of private and public sectors, we could differentiate mediators into three types. First, working conditions, working environment, and students-related factors. On the other hand, each mediator had a different degree of contribution for teachers. So for some teachers, collegiality among the members of the school was very important, whilst for others, this wasn't very important. And the same happened with other mediators, like professional development workshops. In addition, we made a comparison between pre-service and in-service teachers, discovering that in-service teachers are more motivated than pre-service teachers, sorry. This was very surprising. We expected the opposite. And we discovered that pre-service teachers are influenced by negative future predictions of the professions, like low salary, high workload, and among others. And differently, in-service teachers were very resilient against the challenges that the profession entails, and also including those caused by the pandemic. This contrast made us discuss the nature of motivators for both pre-service and in-service teachers. For in-service teachers, their motivation had a focus on teacher-student relationships and student learning. And for pre-service teachers, their motivation covered the idea of making a change in the world. And for demotivators, their role for pre-service teachers was being actual demotivators, but for in-service teachers, they turned them into challenges and professional development opportunities. This research helped us gaining a deeper understanding on teacher motivation and maybe an impetus for other researchers to become interested in teachers' motivation as well. So we believe we can contribute with the following ideas. It's very important that teacher training programs incorporate teacher motivation as a topic, and also that it could be good that they invite experienced teachers and ask them to share their stories, so that it could help pre-service teachers to not be pessimistic about the teaching job. For schools, it will be amazing if the administrators spent more time and resources to increase collegiality among the members of the schools and assist them or create professional development opportunities for the workers, right? And finally, this is a message for policymakers. It is extremely necessary to reduce the financial gap between public and private schools so that everyone has the same opportunities. And they should incorporate teacher motivation research into policy making so that they reflect the reality of the teachers that they are in charge of. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Francisca, for that presentation. Valentina, I'm going to give you the room. I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself so that you can moderate the questions.
Yes. And now it's time for your questions. You can feel free to write whatever you want in the chat box.
No questions, no comments? Should we keep talking?
Well, teacher, let's admit that teacher motivation is not the usual topic that relates more to classroom teaching. So maybe people are just pondering.
Really? Okay.
We have a question. Do you think that teacher motivation is directly proportional to learner motivation? Because at times it is quite different.
Okay, I'll take it.
Okay.
So the relationship between learner motivation and teacher motivation, right? So there have been a couple of studies that looked at the relationship between learner motivation and teacher motivation. And of course, when learner motivation is higher, teacher motivation tends to be higher. But that doesn't mean that learner motivation is the cause or the strongest contributor to teacher motivation. And that's why our study is more comprehensive, let's say, to look for other motivators and demotivators. And actually the findings show that learner motivation was not an important element for teacher motivation as much as other factors. So that's one of the interesting findings. Teachers are motivated or demotivated by other factors than teacher motivation. I mean, learner motivation.
Thank you very much. Nicole wants to know if there's any studies about motivation and digital literacy in teachers.
You'll talk about TPAC or Martina?
Digital literacy in teachers.
Okay, so you cannot unmute yourself, maybe, Martina? You cannot.
I have given her the rights to do that. She can unmute at any time.
There it
Oh,
is.
now, yeah, you are.
sorry. You want to let me
Go.
before. Is there any studies about motivation and digital literacy in teachers? During our research, we didn't really come across much of this topic, digital literacy, not really.
Okay, so digital literacy, it's a part of what is called TPAC. It's a teacher's content and technological knowledge. And I am not aware of a study looking at the relationship between teacher motivation and TPAC, but what is interesting is that TPAC is also context specific, right? So like in some contexts, or some schools even, teachers have different extents of technology accessibility. In some, like in public schools, they tend to have less technology. In private schools, they tend to have more technology. So the amount of technology accessibility they have is context specific. Each teacher has different chance to use technology for their teaching. So is teacher motivation. Individual teachers are motivated and demotivated by different factors. So I think it will be a little complicated research to conduct, but it's a really good topic to look at technology and teacher motivation, especially now.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Nicole asks, does motivation impact on ICT literacy?
I think that, yeah, the same answer.
Yeah.
It's the relationship between two different things.
And also, how can we motivate our students if the teacher is demotivated?
I can answer that. I mean,
Okay, go ahead.
there's no, I mean, if the teacher is demotivated, he or she is not going to show that to their students. According to our research and our funding, they those demotivational factors, they turn them into motivation. For example, the factors that they mentioned were like policymakers, but not the students by themselves. So they weren't, they didn't, if they were demotivated, they didn't show that to their students. So that didn't affect their classes.
Thank you. We have 4 more minutes. If anyone wants to ask something else or maybe leave a comment. Oh, Ivania says, I just wanted to say congratulations to you all for your research. I think it's a very interesting topic in relation to our current situation worldwide.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add just a few more things about motivating students, because that's one of my research topics. So this study that we presented today, it has nothing to do with how to motivate students, but there are certain techniques that teachers can use to motivate their students, such as visualization techniques, or recently mindset intervention is popping up. So like there are certain techniques that teachers can use so that their students can be more motivated, even when the teacher is not motivated to teach. And as Francisca said, our results tend to show that teachers tend to separate their own motivation from their teaching profession. So teachers being demotivated doesn't seem to mean that their teaching is bad.
We have another question. It says, at this moment, many teachers feel demotivated and overwhelmed by extra work they have to do in online teaching. What do you think should be done in this pandemic context to increase teachers' motivation?
Well, first of all, I think it's one of the most interesting points of our study that we came across has to do with this. And it was that most of the in-service teachers that we interviewed, we expected them to feel this way, very overwhelmed, overworked, confused about this new teaching method, everything online. And we were surprised when they told us it was actually something that they took more as a challenge rather than the motivator, right? They said, I want to master the computer. I want to learn new apps, learn how to use this program or this other program to help my students to do this, which is obviously a great attitude to have, but that doesn't take away from the fact that this is completely different from the normal reality of teaching. And we think one of the most important things we should do to help teachers and not feel as you said, overwhelmed by this extra work and this new reality also has to deal with what we talked about, which is collegiality and just sharing our knowledge. Obviously, there's people that are going to be more savvy with technology and are going to understand more and know more programs, know how to use this in your online classes. And sharing that knowledge with other teachers is what we need to be doing so that everyone can have the same resources outside of what we all have available. That's another issue that schools and maybe even the government should be supplying more and better equipment to do the classes. But in terms of content, I think it's that community helping each other and just giving each other advice, tips, and knowledge.
Thank you very much for that, Valentina. I think we run out of time now for questions. We are exactly within the 30-minute mark and we need to leave 10 minutes as a break in the room.